just introduce myself. My name's Stephen Petro. Most of you know me. There are some people who I'm seeing for the first time, which is really encouraging. And welcome, everybody. What I'd like this to be is sort of, I'll talk for a bit, and then I'd like to have a little bit of a discussion, have some questions, and maybe get into some issues that you really want to talk about. So I'll just start off just introducing the talk. So the title, as you can see, is Value, Innateness, and Universal Moral Grammar, Normative Implications of the Cognitive System. And you'll see in a bit what exactly that's all about. So I'll start off by saying that this lecture might seem to many of you to cover kind of an arcane topic with little immediate relevance to your life. I think that's what a lot of people think of value theory, maybe. And many of you are involved in maybe like political science, psychology, medicine, biochemistry, physics, right, sociology, history, and so on. All of which I and anyone who has any global awareness whatsoever would characterize as extremely important and relevant to life. So then we have to do a bit of a double take, I think. And it was this sort of double take that actually ultimately made me want to do research in this field. Because when we take a very close look, I believe, we realize that value theory underlies every one of these fields, and not in a trite, abstract way either. In every line of research or inquiry, or really any activity in general, we ultimately have to ask ourselves why we're engaged in that activity, right? Whether we have any reason to be engaged in that activity, or alternatively, whether our engagement in such an activity is justified. So in political science and such subfields as comparative political science and political economy, we pose questions related to the formation of the state, the development of democracy, anarchy, and totalitarianism, as well as the nature of capitalism and the role of organizations that oversee international finance, such as the IMF and World Bank. Indeed, we're pressed with important questions concerning international finance in general, especially today. So in psychology, we ask, for instance, fundamental questions about the nature of human behavior, whether, how, and to what extent human values guide human action, and ultimately how the empirical evidence derived from the work in this field applies to issues ranging from gun violence to ethnic conflict to constructive cooperation and group decision making. In medicine, questions abound regarding, for instance, euthanasia and end-of-life care, research on human subjects, and the provision and rationing of patient care, the regulation of pharmaceuticals, even issues of hospital management. In biochemistry and physics alike, experts ultimately are going to have to appeal to the question of how their research or discovery will contribute to human knowledge, industrial advancement and innovation, or even their own personal satisfaction, which I believe we must not overlook as important and relevant. In history and sociology, we ask yet further vital questions, not only about human behavior, but also about personal experience and the sordid yet inspiring path that humankind has thus far traversed. So in each field, each activity, each line of inquiry, the philosophical questions of value theory are rarely very far removed from immediate practical application. These questions arise most readily, I find, in moments of conflict. When we examine these moments of conflict, we see that we are inevitably forced to contend with value theory directly and explicitly, with, for instance, the question of whether a sit-in or a lockout is justified, whether patients have a right to care which supersedes, for instance, an individual's right against undue taxation, which we face. This is a huge debate right now, today, or whether I should pass by the homeless person on the street or give money to him or her. So to choose, as it were, a conception of justice and a value orientation. Whether or not some of us would like to claim that we are simply apathetic about such questions, the fact is that we already assume a value orientation and a conception of justice, whether we like it or not. It is my sincere hope, however, that we seriously engage with these questions sooner than later, before we find ourselves inevitably in a situation which forces us to come out of hiding and to choose, openly and explicitly, a value system. The idea I'm expressing here is the underlying current in what is called dialectical ethical theory. So we answered these questions, and we answered that question. So, yeah, as I said, the idea that I'm hinting toward is one that's very prominent in what's called dialectical ethical theory. So, most prominently represented in the work of Alan Gewirth, Jürgen Habermas, Karl Otto Appel, and R.M. Hare. You may or may not recognize some of these names. We find in their own work the idea that it is utterly inevitable and necessary in our existence as moral agents that we make certain judgments concerning our actions and their relation to the world, and in a more profound sense, that at the foundation of all of these judgments lie normative judgments, or judgments of value, right? The further implication in their work is that certain kinds of normative judgments cannot be denied without incurring contradiction, or at least some form of inconsistency, from which it would follow that such claims, regardless of their semantic content, could not be true, or in the case of mere consistency, could not be valid. This echoes certain ideas in Immanuel Kant's deontological theory. Some of you might be studying him right now, of which there have been many variations and reconstructions, as seen in the work of Scanlon, Parfit, O'Neill, Korsgaard, and a myriad of others, from its original formulation in the 18th century to the present day. Yet, while promising in many respects too close an adherence to the distinctions and maxims Kant originally formulated, has steered ethics, and in turn value theory more generally, down an ever-narrowing path with ever more limited theoretical applicability. One of the main reasons for this, I believe, has been the Kantian conception of agency, which we should acknowledge does not accord with the characterizations yielded by social cognitive theory, cognitive neuroscience, theoretical developments in philosophical phenomenology, and other related fields. Utilitarianism, by contrast, has been largely a failure, as not only is it founded philosophically on easily dubitable assumptions, but it is also empirically implausible. The model of the utility-maximizing agent might be predictively useful in certain economic models, but there is enough psychological and anthropological evidence to demonstrate that this is not the case in other spheres of social activity and motivation. Various new forms of relativism, subjectivism, and emotivism have arisen throughout the 20th century, but they've proven to be largely mired in conceptual confusions and contradictions. Nihilism, which has a few different characterizations ranging from being a claim about the non-existence of truth values associated with value statements to the non-existence of value itself, has also been greatly problematized by value theorists. It turns out that these last four theories, relativism, subjectivism, emotivism, and nihilism, require a fairly simple method to disprove. As I've shown, and as I'll go into more detail on shortly, a negative justificatory approach is a necessary first step toward discovering a sound positive theory of value. In other words, I believe it is most methodologically sound to demonstrate why all or most other alternatives are implausible or even invalid before attempting to develop a plausible alternative theory. As we'll see, it's much more difficult to establish positive normative theory, or value theory, than it is to discredit competing models. So then we're stuck in a bit of an aporia, it seems. It seems as though we've discredited all alternatives at once, right? So then where do we go from here? Well, let's remember our original aim. It was to discover a sound theory of value, and not simply a sound theory of ethics. Surprisingly, however, I think it is one particular model for value theories specifically, or ethical theory specifically, which provides us with leads toward the achievement of the same. And again, this model is dialectical ethics. This model, as I said, is the dialectical approach. And the dialectical approach to ethics, I think, takes us out of this persistent aporia for various reasons, all of which ultimately derive from a sound psychological, neurophysiological, and phenomenological account of the phenomenon of rationality. I'm using a lot of terminology, but there will be time for questions and everything. As we'll see, although virtue theory has for some time lacked solid foundations and has subsisted mainly upon easily dubitable assumptions, it turns out, in light of a consideration of the essential elements of dialectical theory, to be actually an extremely powerful value theory, which of course not only touches ethics and finds concrete application in real-life situations, but which also applies readily to all discourse on value, including all of the fields and activities all the fields and activities I previously mentioned. As we'll see, one vital element which bridges the seeming gap between dialectical deontological theory and virtue theory, which there's notably sort of this gap that's been posed between them. So one of the bridges between this seeming gap is their mutual compatibility and ultimately adherence to a particular sound social cognitive and phenomenological account of rationality. And this will be important as we go on, so keep that in mind. Not only does this bridge demonstrate a conceptual compatibility with deontology and virtue theory, but it also demonstrates, via an intricate chain of insight provided by dialectical theory, that deontology is ultimately dependent on virtue theory, and archaic concepts more generally for its validity. Indeed, virtue theory assumes a supreme and unique role as a universally applicable theory, a framework within which the dialectical deontological model, not itself possessing universal applicability, is a sort of axiological module possessing a functional fit, enhancing and rendering more determinate the particular virtue typically recognized as central to the virtue theoretical model, namely phronesis, or good judgment, what's translated as good judgment. In order to understand the nature of value theory, it is important first to understand the concept of rationality. And we'll see shortly why rationality is even relevant at all. Of course, the question, what is rationality, has been an age-old question in and of itself. We are, however, in a very privileged position at this period in history, I think. Not only has an entire tradition of philosophical inquiry known as phenomenology arisen, which has given us insight into the nature of rationality, but so too has an entire branch of social cognitive theory, namely social learning theory, formulated and repeatedly tested by Albert Bandura and others, which has demonstrated immense predictive and explanatory power. His model, in addition to some extent, those of Vygotsky, Piaget, Kohlberg, Yuichi, and Shota, completely discredit a behavioristic or otherwise linearly conceived chain of causation with respect to agency. People don't react automatically to their environments, at least not in what would be characterized as a free action, which I'll discuss shortly. And even in actions that would be considered unfree or non-voluntary, what we usually think of as strictly biological causation is more often a sort of hybrid bioenvironmental causation, subject to epigenetic factors as well as others. So hard determinism as it concerns rationality is simply out of the question. The approach we need to take to rationality, an approach I also take with regards to value, is what I call a transcendental reductionism. There you go, more terminology, but it'll be explained. So in philosophy, the term transcendental, not to be confused with the term transcendent, means preconditional or foundational concepts necessary for a particular system and upon which everything else in that system is necessarily built. So that's a rough idea of it for you. So my method for discovering what rationality is simply that. Let's investigate every possible use of the word rationality and then proceed to offer the most very general concepts upon which are founded any and all conceptions of rationality. So this sounds like a really tall order, right? And it certainly is, but I think it's very feasible. William Rothschild has offered a reconstruction of Bandura's model of agency, and let me go through it here. So just very quickly, this is Rothschild's multi-tiered reconstruction of Bandura's model of agency. So if any of you in here have taken psychology or psychology? Okay, so are you familiar with this a little bit? Okay, so there's base level agency, behavioral level agency, reflective agency, and what's called the self system, which is sort of an all-encompassing view of agency. And this seems sort of vague, but there are ways of measuring a lot of these parameters, and the parameter specifically being measured as you go up from base level agency all the way to self-system is an increasing self-awareness, self-consciousness, and self-control. So, or at least an increasing capacity for self-control. And that's, I mean, it's much more complex than we can go into just in a brief discussion. But it becomes very important when we discuss later how rationality is relevant to ethics or value theory. So just keep it in mind. Another important line of research in the area of cognitive neuroscience, and in particular the work of Benjamin Libet and Michael Gazzaniga on the neurophysiological processes associated with decision-making. Libet measured the activity of his subjects' brains using a technique known as event-related potentials, while the subjects made a conscious and voluntary hand movement. Has anybody here taken any neuroscience or in neuroscience? So, okay, have you heard of Gazzaniga at all, or Libet? Okay, so maybe some more advanced research. But so essentially, Gazzaniga offers his own interpretation of Libet's experiments. He says, quote, Libet found that even before what's called time t, when the subject first became consciously aware of his decision to make a hand movement, the subject's brain was active. The readiness potential was present. The time between the onset of what's called the readiness potential and the moment of conscious decision-making was about 300 milliseconds. If the readiness potential of the brain begins before we are aware of making the decision to move our hand, it would appear that our brains know our decisions before we become conscious of them. Libet argued that because the time from the onset of the readiness potential to the actual hand movement is about 500 milliseconds, and it takes 50 to 100 milliseconds for the neural signal to travel from the brain to the hand to actually make the hand move, 100 milliseconds are left for the conscious self to either go with the unconscious decision or veto it. And that, he said, is where free will comes in the veto power. Since then, Libet has offered an account of what he calls the conscious mental field theory to explain his results. Voluntary action, mediated by a process of symbolization and cognitive representation, is indeed an active process, mediated by judgment. And all of this evidence suggests this. I'm not going to go into detail on Hauser's biological anthropological theory of what he calls humaniqueness here, but his theory, as well as others, corroborate this. So, but why is any of this relevant? We're going into, rationality and, cognition. So it's not, after all, supposed to be a talk about consciousness or the mind. It's a talk about value theory. Well, it's relevant because central to all of the dialectical theories is a particular conception of rationality. And these conceptions end up being highly relevant to the soundness of their respective conclusions. Unfortunately, however, none of them, save for Habermas in his use of Kohlberg, corroborate their respective characterizations of rationality with more than a formalistic a priori approach. While this a priori approach is indeed adequate to demonstrate the soundness of these theories, it is in neglecting a more rigorous empirical and phenomenological analysis of rationality that they've overlooked fundamental concepts, which in fact extend some of the formalistic analyses of value judgment that they themselves have undertaken. This is especially momentous because I believe that the synthesis of such an analysis with their own formalistic analyses of value judgment yields the synthesis of deontic and archaic concepts via the instantiation of what should be seen as equally momentous, namely a grammar of goodness, or otherwise what might be called an innate value grammar. And that is, I believe, the most important aspect of what I have attempted to establish, and what other theorists have until this point simply broached. The elucidation of such an innate value grammar, as we shall see, is the central purpose of this talk. So, we've discussed this, and we've discussed a bit of phenomenology. So, from this point, what many of you might begin to wonder is whether this theory, so heavily focused on the concept of rationality, implies some sort of elitist morality or aesthetic, whereby all the most intelligent people, right, have the most rights or normative privileges, and all others are to be sort of subjugated or oppressed. But this is emphatically not what my theory implies. In fact, it implies just about the complete opposite. Unfortunately, this perceived implication is, I believe, the result of the history of the use of the word rationality, which has long been a word of condemnation toward women, people of color, poor people, and many others. By contrast, I believe it to be a word of liberation. And this is especially through my partial revision of the concept to include, as per my transcendental reductionist method, the concept of experiential rationality. So we'll see experiential rationality is just as important as this other idea that is so prevalent in philosophy of logical rationality. And we can't forget to include that when we're studying the phenomenon of rationality. I'm not going to go into great detail into this talk as to what this concept is, but suffice it to say that the inclusion of experiential rationality into this proposed framework reorients the concept of rationality from what I've said is a long-standing tradition of a logical, mathematical, deductive, and inductive conception of rationality to something more holistic. So then, let's back up for a bit and reintroduce rationality a bit later when we can observe its direct relevance to the theory. So, we discussed before the idea of a negative method of justification targeted toward eliminating and exposing as implausible alternative theories of value, correct? Through this method, I claim we're capable of eliminating things like nihilism, relativism, subjectivism, emotivism, certain kinds of utilitarianism, and even anti-descriptivism in general from consideration, where anti-descriptivism is the position that goodness or value is not actually a property of reality. So, first, however, we'll need to analyze Hare's dialectically contingent universal prescriptivist theory. So now Hare's theory is considered dialectically contingent for a few reasons. Hare analyzes ethical statements and concludes that although ethical statements have no truth values, because he takes the anti-descriptivist position, that does not mean that, as all language does, ethical statements don't follow some sort of necessary rules. Indeed, he claims they do follow rules, and all ethical statements can be reduced to principles, or echoing Kant, maxims. The difference lying at the heart of Hare's theory, however, is his dialectical approach to maxim universalization. So universalization is a fairly straightforward deductive maneuver in logic, but the manner in which he does so is very highly problematic. So Hare tells us that in every action we undertake, we abide by some principle and apply it to that specific situation, right? So if I prescribe for myself the principle, I should inflict pain on John when it is my preference to do so, then I must universalize this statement in the following way. So X should inflict pain on Y when it is X's preference to do so. The determination of what is relevant, Hare explains, is entirely up to me. So in this situation, we see that the criterion of relevant similarities is when it is X's preference to do so. That's the relevant criterion that I've set up, or somebody has set up. So I don't have the time to go into great depth on the problems with this logical maneuver, but suffice it to say that Hare has demonstrated no specific method whereby the first statement entails the second. In other words, why should I universalize this statement? The theory also suffers from the fact that it is founded upon question-begging anti-descriptivist assumptions, as well as several dubitable moral psychological claims about the legitimacy and coherence of preference and desire as legitimating moral criteria. So for instance, one of the major problems we can see is what I call the vacuous universalization problem. So in logic, we can universalize any statement vacuously. So for instance, we might utter the statement, all instances of A are A, which is trivial, but which nonetheless compromises Hare's theory, as you can see. We can vacuously universalize his statement, all instances of me in all instances of this specific situation should inflict pain on all instances of John. We can do that, we can universalize vacuously. So then, Hare's theory, though, does help us in a very specific manner. If we undertake a particular reconstruction of his argument, we end up with a particular theoretical tool, which in fact aids us in invalidating certain theories. Not all theories, but certain theories. And we end up with a comprehensive list of rules from this, by which any theory must abide in order to be at least plausible. So then at this point we seem to have invalidated certain kinds of value judgments using these rules. For instance, those citing solely my emotional state, my desires, or my preferences as justificatory criteria. So obviously I don't have enough time here to show precisely how I've derived these rules and why, for instance, the implicit normative claim here, namely that one should use these rules, is not itself question-begging or circular. But I make my argument on this very clear, however, in the book. So now we've swept away certain theoretical frameworks from consideration. We can begin to build a positive account of value theory, or an account of what does constitute a true value judgment and a sound value judgment. So Goworth's theory, it turns out, is a very powerful theory. And unlike Hare's, it is a dialectically necessary theory. So what this means is that his argument is one about what all agents necessarily assert or imply by engaging in any action, and not specifically about what is true about such assertions. So again, his argument concerns only that which agents must admit on pain of contradiction. Otherwise, the theory would be what is called assertorically necessary. So I'll just explain this a little bit. So, so you see here, the theory, Goworth's theory is dialectically necessary in that there's a necessary statement entailed here by acting. If I act, if I do something voluntarily, I implicitly assert I do X for purpose E. And even this claim has been disputed, but I think it's very well defended. I think it's very well substantiated. So the claim here is that it's not possible for an agent to claim otherwise without incurring some form of contradiction. So if I say all agents assert I do X for purpose E, but then I say to you, well, you do not implicitly assert this, or I do not implicitly assert this. Either way, you are making the claim implicitly. You're also implying, that you are not an agent, and we'll see that in a bit. Why that's the case? It's actually a simple. If you're familiar with logic, it's a simple conditional statement. So these are the central premises of Goworth's argument, and this is something I analyzed in quite some depth, but there's another author and adherent to this theory, Derek Belveld, who has analyzed these premises ad nauseum, essentially, and very, very intensively, demonstrating, I think, that they are that it's a sound argument. So the first premise, as I said, is all agents implicitly assert I do X for purpose E. That's simple enough for a lot of people. The next one is a little bit more controversial, but I think also well defended. All agents implicitly assert X is good, for me or otherwise. So the claim is that if you pursue some action, you are claiming in some sense that it's valuable, or at least it's not disvaluable, or at least it's more valuable than some alternative. And that's I think, again, well defended, but controversial as well. All agents implicitly assert I ought to do or have X. So if you engage in some action voluntarily, you are implicitly asserting that you ought to do that action. Even if you sort of consciously state, no, this is something that's bad, this is something that's wrong, you are acknowledging, or you sort of have to logically, implicitly accept that that's an alternative that you would endorse in that situation, as opposed to some other alternative. So the next statement, next premise is all agents implicitly assert all other agents must at least not interfere with my doing or having X. And this is actually the really interesting part of the argument, because Goworth is saying that if you say I ought, or if you imply I ought to do or have X, then you are at the same time implying all other agents must at least not interfere with my doing that. So, and then the next one, all agents implicitly assert I have a right to X. So this is actually one of the most controversial premises of his, but again, I think well defended. And I think it follows from this last premise, and we can go into why that is in a second. But if you then look at this transition, this is a really interesting part. All agents implicitly assert I have a right to the freedom to X. So if you claim that I have a right to X, or all other agents must at least not interfere with my doing or having X, you also assert the right to the freedom to do that. So you have asserted some right to some sort of freedom. And then all agents implicitly assert, I have a right to freedom. In his version of the argument, he says, I have a right to freedom and well-being. But I've abridged this. I actually think the freedom part here encompasses the well-being part. And that's sort of my own interpretation. And that can be debated, but I think it's correct. And then the conclusion is, therefore, an agent who denies that another agent has a right to freedom against others, including her, in doing X, denies that she herself is an agent. And so this is actually this is just a conditional statement, because if agents assert, if it is the case that all agents assert X, right, then if not X is the case, then it follows, it just follows logically that the antecedent is not the case. Therefore, you're not an agent. So you actually, it's a very interesting argument, because he's essentially saying, you know, you're incurring some contradiction, some major contradiction, when you're saying that other people don't have the same rights to freedom as you do, which is a really interesting argument. And his argument is an argument about not only negative rights against something, but it's rights too. So you have rights to food, clothing, shelter. These are the claims that he makes as well. And the power of it, the power again, is that it's dialectically necessary. It's a priori true. You cannot deny it logically. So, and that's the power of those kinds of arguments. Now, in Habermas's theory, is anybody familiar with Habermas except you, Dr. Lee? Yeah, Jürgen Habermas. He's a great thinker, and he's world-renowned. But his ethical theory is a little less well-known. So his claim is dialectically necessary. At least I'm characterizing it that way. And he says, essentially, his central dialectical claim is, by engaging in discourse with others, I assume and accept as valid certain norms. So when I engage in discourse with you, I am actually implicitly accepting certain norms. And I'm actually not only accepting a norm, but I'm prescribing a norm to you. So there's a whole lot that really flows from this, and that really is implied by this. And we're not going to go through the whole reconstruction of the Habermasian argument that I give, but I completely reconstruct the argument, and I place it on a priori foundations, necessary logical foundations. He's in a different school of thought, which rejects logical foundations. So I'm sort of making his argument an analytic argument, as opposed to a critical theory argument. And you know, I can give anybody who wants these slides after these slides, but here's the most important part. So how I've interpreted his argument is, in the conclusion, is very important. So he is essentially claiming, I think, that if I assert that I am absolutely certain of my conclusions, and that I cannot be wrong about these conclusions, then I implicitly assert that the person who I'm discoursing with is not an agent. So there's also what I call alter contradiction, as opposed to what he calls performative contradiction. You're contradicting the other's agency. And it's a similar argument, I think, to Gore's argument. They end up in the same place. And really, what the power of the theories is that, I got off script a little bit here, but I think that we end up with a very powerful combined account of ethical theory through the two theories, which bears much application to a wide range of moral dilemmas and conflicts. So remember, at the end of the day, we need to be able to apply any ethical theory. And I've explicitly demonstrated how this is the case. In the second case, we've proved that there are such things as sound normative arguments. And although this isn't a deductive proof that value is innate, intrinsic, or otherwise objective, it offers us, along with the discrediting of anti-descriptivism, internalism, and other theories, yet further good prima facie reason to continue to search for some sort of basis for intrinsic objective value, and the existence of a sound overarching value theory. For so far, it seems as though we found good evidence to conclude that there might indeed be such a thing. If there are these sorts of sound kinds of arguments, it stands to reason that there might be some further basis for objective value. So now let's take a closer look at these theories. Is our task done? We have to ask that. Clearly not. Based on the prompt that I just offered, but what specifically is left unaddressed? So this question is a basic question any theorist in any field should ask. So where is it that my theory does not apply, if anywhere? The first hint actually lies in the initial premises of Gorath's theory, namely the following two. X is good, and I ought to do X. The two statements seem somehow to be conceptually connected, but it is not immediately clear how. And most importantly, the dialectical theories give us no information about what good, ought, or must actually mean. But to many of you, this might seem like a sort of nitpicking. Why do we need to define these terms at all if we've already, if we have an accurate idea of how we are to apply them, right? So the answer to this is that a serious analysis of their meaning at once reveals a fundamental link between the aortaic, or good, terms and the deontic, or must, terms, and thus the fundamental link between virtue theory and deontology, which is sort of like an age-old dispute. But of course you might ask, why does this help us? Bless you. Well, the simple fact is that, as they stand, the dialectical theories lack application to all scenarios and circumstances, right? We want a theory, at the end of the day, that applies to everything. Ultimately, if we want a physical theory, we want it to apply to everything. Isn't that right? We want a physical theory that, well, you do physics, that's why I'm pointing to you. But, and a sociological theory, we want it to apply to everything. So, then, basically, one second. So essentially, what I'm going to point out here is that what I call the single person problem. I set up this idea called the single person problem, and I'm demonstrating that it demonstrates the limits of dialectical deontology. Not only dialectical deontology, but pretty much every other ethical theory except virtue theory, which is important. And so in most ethical theories we're asking, what should I do, right? And that's sort of, it seems like somewhat of a question that can be somewhat answered by the dialectical theories, and it gives a lot of answers to that question. But what Michael Sloat, who's a virtue theorist, points out is that there's something which he calls the self-other asymmetry, where these theories actually they focus so much on what you should do with respect to that question's relation to other people, that once, it sort of doesn't permit enough focus on self-focused questions. So, for instance, to be more precise, the specific questions that I've set out that I think it doesn't apply to or doesn't answer is, for instance, these kinds of questions. So, should I pursue friendship? A rights-based theory, specifically I'm thinking of a rights-based theory, what kind of an answer could a rights-based theory give to that? Well, it could say, yeah, pursue friendship as long as it doesn't violate anybody's rights, or don't pursue it, whatever you prefer. And what happens is you end up with a very sort of vacuous theory past a certain point. Because essentially, at a certain point, you start asking these questions. Should I pursue contemplation? Should I pursue pleasure? Which field should I study, if any? Which job or economic enterprise should I undertake, if any? And they become unanswerable from the standpoint, I think, of a dialectical deontological theory, because the answer at the end of the day, I think, ends up being something along the lines of, well, if it doesn't violate anybody's rights. Now, there's some sort of duty-based argument you could make for some of these. That you have a duty to pleasure to yourself. You have a duty to contemplation. You have a duty to make friends. And I think that ultimately actually ends up being inadequate as well. But, so where do we go? Where do we go? Well, going back briefly to the concept of rationality, we'll see shortly that the concept of rationality is central to answering these questions, and that it's central precisely because rationality is an essential part of the framework for what I've been calling a grammar of value or a grammar of goodness. You see, it's only when we take certain insights from the dialectical theories, one of them being the necessity of value judgment, and undertake a rigorous logical and semantic analysis of good, ought, and must, that we can actually establish not only assertorically necessary value judgments, but true and objective value judgments. Going further with this thesis, by establishing a grammar of value, we can actually define value or goodness, again, via a transcendental reductionist method. So then if we're searching for a grammar of goodness, where do we possibly begin? I mean, this seems so difficult, right? Well, first, let's be more precise about what's meant by a grammar of goodness. Well, a large part of philosophy in the 20th century has been characterized by what's called the linguistic turn, which has been concurrent with such a turn in other fields as anthropology, sociology, and psychology. This turn or trend has been characterized by an approach to answering fundamental questions in philosophy utilizing analyses of language, with a focus toward understanding what we mean literally when we perform certain utterances, and also how the syntactical and general grammatical structure we employ affects the meaning or logical structure of our utterances. There have been various incarnations of this, from analytic philosophy to hermeneutics, to structuralism and post-structuralism, right? Of course, there are various methods or approaches which have themselves developed within each of these respective schools of thought as well. As one can imagine, these schools of thought have approached value theory in very different ways too, although I won't go into depth concerning exactly what these differences consist. But what I will admit is that my approach is in line with the analytic tradition, and that I believe this tradition to be at least mostly on the right track. One of the most notable ideas of the analytic tradition was that certain words and expressions have meaning only within a certain conceptual context, framework, or even language game. Just as we cannot make sense of a square circle, right, a non-organism cat, or a green dream sleeping furiously, at least not literally, and that's important, there are certain ways of using value words and value expressions, too, that cannot have any meaning outside of certain contexts or conceptual frameworks. So, although such thinkers as Wittgenstein, Geach, Moore, and Anscombe have engaged in exhaustive analyses in order to discover the semantic and logical structure that gives meaning to the concept of goodness or value, there's a peculiar amalgamation of ideas which I believe, when brought in collaboration with each other in the correct way, actually yield some very promising leads. The work of Philippa Foot, Rudolf Carnap, and Thomas Magnell, who's unfortunately could not make it this evening, professor here, I believe combined with certain insights derived from the dialectical theories, illuminate the path forward. So Carnap was one of the first to make explicit the analytic thesis on the existence of linguistic conceptual or linguistic empirical frameworks. Foot, also very much steeped in this tradition, developed the explicit thesis that there was indeed a grammar of goodness, or in other words, such a linguistic conceptual framework which gave statements of moral or aesthetic goodness meaning. Her thesis, indeed a fairly recent development, is that such statements are founded in a grammar of living things. In other words, she claims it is the concept of a living organism which gives such goodness meaning. Outside of this context, statements of moral and aesthetic goodness are meaningless. While I believe her thesis constitutes a momentously important attempt at demarcating the grammatical framework for value statements, and while I believe it takes us in the overall right direction, I believe it still falls short of completing a necessary task, defining goodness. In addition, as will be apparent shortly, it is incorrect to claim that statements of goodness are demarcated by a life framework. I believe they extend much further than this, actually. The analyses that Magnell has undertaken in turn help to demonstrate this. The criteria he has set out for determining what constitutes intrinsic goodness demonstrates that even something so general as existence itself encompasses such a grammatical framework. Now, I was going to read the part where I actually discuss Magnell's classifications, but it might take too long. I think I'm going to skip it for sake of time. But needless to say, the methods many others have used in order to demonstrate the existence of an innate a priori value grammar have had particular shortcomings. But I believe the transcendental reductionist method to be superior. So let's explore where the method takes us. Let's first examine every way in which the word good is used. In every culture, at every time, in every place. So immediately, most anthropologists, sociologists, and psychologists might stop me there to tell me this is impossible. But is it? So is it not possible to find some elements of a concept so general and so foundational that no statement of goodness could be uttered without invoking them in some way? So I've claimed that it is indeed possible. What we need to do first is once again revisit the dialectical method. So in the book, and as you see on your screen here, I have undertaken an exhaustive logical semantic analysis of the terms ought, must, and good. And although an elucidation of the analysis would require an entire lecture in and of itself, I found that must statements and ought statements are directly logically related to statements of goodness via a general, although sometimes very complex, conditional relationship, logically conditional relationship. Ought statements, we see, are mediators of must statements, or otherwise statements of categorical obligation. Statements of categorical obligation are always teleological via its logical relationship to the antecedent. And what does that mean? So essentially, you must do something for something. Something is always necessary for something else. Something is necessary to something else. This is always a teleological relationship, always toward an end. So I see this finding as important because this teleological way is exactly the way in which Gewerth characterized statements of goodness, and I very much agree. So then we must dig more deeply. What specifically does all of this analysis demonstrate? It demonstrates that goodness is always tied to some statement of necessity. This, of course, is a rather old thesis, which has reemerged from time to time. No one, however, has ever tied this phenomenon of necessity inherent in statements of value or goodness to a general definition of goodness that could be objectively applied. No one, in other words, has ever clarified what kind of necessity this is. Again, without delving too deeply into how I've come to this conclusion and then doing a whole other lecture by itself, we find that this necessity is what I call tendential necessity, or a necessary tendency of X toward Y. After yet another analysis, I find that function is indeed central to the concept of goodness, indeed any conception of goodness. And of course, any Aristotelian would agree with me. Any adherent to Aristotle would agree, yes, function. And most virtue theorists would agree with me on that. But now, let's stop here. It seems as though the achievement of the definition of goodness has been rather anticlimactic, right? It's anticlimactic, and in some sense this is true. In the first case, this definition does not seem to be very useful. It does not tell us which things are good. All it tells us is that something exists which has some necessary tendency to yield some other thing. It's a very general sort of transcendental feature of goodness. But of course, the definition of goodness is simply the first step. I believe that what we are really searching for when we attempt to discover what is good or bad is really what is better or worse, or best or worst. In other words, the definition of goodness is mostly vacuous, for it does not help us do what we require, namely, discover what we should do as an alternative to something else. It's the relationship between one thing and its alternative, what we should acknowledge as comparativeness, that is central to questions of value. And so, but even the nearly vacuous definition of goodness, however, gives us something. And this is what excites me so much. And something which is indeed momentous. And that something is the unveiling of a definitive grammar of goodness. Without again jumping into the precise logical steps of the argument, let's ask the question, why is function good? Or why is tendency good? Or even, why is necessity good? And we find that this is actually very similar to the question, why is a cat an organism? In other words, we begin to find that these are concepts that are central to a value grammar. It does not follow from this fact alone, however, that function, necessity, and tendency are themselves intrinsically good. This does follow from some statement, but from a very specific sort of statement, namely a statement about what I call the reflexive intrinsicality of goodness. So remember that we emphasized the centrality of the concept of necessity to goodness. As it turns out, the centrality of this concept is in itself momentous. For we might notice we might notice that, as is almost never the case in philosophy or any other case, that this fact actually yields tautologies about goodness that are extremely interesting. They're actually extremely interesting tautologies, which one would never think a tautology would be interesting. If P, then P. It's usually not very interesting. But when we closely examine the statement, we find that if something is necessary, it is also tendentially necessary. It is simply that the associated probability value, or what I'm calling the tendency, is equal to 1. This literally means that these constituent concepts make possible the concept of goodness. The concept of goodness would be impossible without them. And as such, they are literally the best for goodness. And so they are intrinsically good. So let us, however, confirm this against Magnell's analysis. So I will read a little bit of his own. Actually, let's back up. I don't want you to see that yet. So in order for good to have a semantically predicative role, maybe most of you, you may or may not understand this, but try to follow, because it's got a lot of jargon. But we can talk about it later if you want. So in order for good to have what's called a semantically predicative role, he states, we'd need to find, quote, a predicate with an extension that necessarily includes as a subclass of its extension the extension of the predicate of the given sentence, unquote. It's okay if you didn't understand that. I didn't understand it the first time I read it either. So in the assertion, for instance, in the assertion, this is a good knife, for instance, this is clearly not the case, as the assertion of goodness might not also apply to the assertion, this is a good butter knife, or this is a good steak knife. Magnell thus does indeed offer us a challenge. We must see, however, that we have indeed satisfied these criteria. For instance, let us now notice that in order to state truly that these constituent concepts are good, we must also imply that the existence of these constituent concepts is good. So this is momentous too. Once again, if existence is necessary for these concepts, then existence must be good. Existence must be good. When we state existence is the best thing there is, however, consider that we're not really saying much, since existence is truly the only thing there is, right? Or, if you like, the only thing that exists. This statement, however, is at best a tautology and extremely uninformative. So, existence is the best thing that exists is therefore equally as vacuous and uninformative. But while a bit tiresome, it is indeed momentous, since it demonstrates that something can be intrinsically good. And we should briefly examine this. So let's recall Magnell's requirement that any predicative use of good must pick out a predicate with an extension that necessarily includes as a subclass of its extension the extension of the predicate of the given sentence. So let's take the example I've given above. Existence is good. This is a true statement. This is a true statement. But does it fulfill Magnell's criteria? Yes. Consider what existence is good entails. It entails the expression good existence. If good has an extension that necessarily includes as a subclass of its extension the extension of the predicate existence, then good, as used here, is predicative. And we can test this using two methods, but I'm not going to go into that. But here's an interesting point. So I have an interesting point, I swear. So in the extension things which exist, well, hold on. I'll back up a little bit. So good is actually a term that has in its extension the extension things which exist. Okay? And since it is a necessary condition of something's being tendentially necessary for something, that something exists which has some tendential necessity, all things we see have tendential necessity for almost an innumerable amount of things. Indeed, we can state that all things which exist are tendentially necessary for tendential necessity itself. We can thus say, this is good, whatever this may happen to be. Now, that's actually a momentous conclusion in itself. It means that everything is good. In some sense, everything is good. Except it's not Leibniz's conclusion that this is the best of all possible worlds. That's a different conclusion. So the next step in this, despite being admittedly very tiresome, I mean it's complex analysis. All of this is momentous for various reasons, which I will not discuss fully here. But it's particularly important for our next steps. And our next step is to discover not merely what is good, but what is better. So I'm actually I wanted to read this, but I realize it might be too long. What I'll go into here is just a little bit of an explanation. The same thing we talked about with regards to reflexive intrinsicality of goodness, that sort of there's a tautological relationship that's actually really important. It looks a bit silly, like betterness is necessary for betterness. Well, of course it is. A is necessary for A. But this is actually, again, it's really important because necessity, the idea of necessity, is central to the idea of goodness. It's also essential to the idea of something's being better, betterness. And again, I actually, what I'm claiming that it is something called teleological comparativeness. So I'm just going to read a little bit of how I come to this conclusion. So to state that something is better, we should see, is to state that something is comparatively more tendentially necessary. But comparatively more tendentially necessary for what? Certainly we won't say that something is comparatively more tendentially necessary for the tendential necessity of functions. We'll be stuck right in the same condition. We'll be saying that something's better for goodness and not better for what is better, for instance. So it doesn't solve our issue. We don't want to know what is wider for widerness, what's larger for largeness, for instance, or more massive for massiveness. We wanted to know what's wider in comparison to the wider or widest thing, what's larger in comparison to the larger or largest thing, and what's massive in comparison to the more or most massive thing. So it's the same thing with goodness. So let's consider some objections. Hold on. Okay, actually, this is what I wanted to talk about. So this concept is central, teleological comparativeness. And what does it mean? It means not simply comparativeness where something is wider, for instance. You see two things and you say this is wider than that. This is I think, wider than that. But you are actually now talking about a different kind of comparativeness that's essential to betterness, specifically. And that's teleological comparativeness. And I analyze this very closely with respect to this concept, this normative concept. And if you think very closely about it, what we're doing, whenever we're saying something is better, something is good, or something is better, or something is best, we're always implying that it's better or best for X, for something else. And that sort of, it's implicit even if we don't say it. It's always a teleological comparativeness. And again, not an assumption, something that's worked out in detail in the book. But so now again, we can take a look at this and see what's going on. The constituent concepts of betterness and bestness make any conception of betterness and bestness possible. They're simply best. And they're essentially transcendental conditions for something to be better, something to be best, anything to be better or best. And so we're looking for something more, though. So, okay, this brings us to an objection. Why is comparativeness or something's being comparative necessary for something's being better, but not necessary for something's being wide? Both terms are predicated on the use of comparison, so why is comparison not necessary for widerness? Is there not a discrepancy here? There is indeed a discrepancy here, but one that's perfectly sensible. Something's being comparative or having comparativeness, we said, is not necessary for something's being wider, but only in an observer relative sense. I think I'll skip ahead. So they must be comparative in relation to each other. Again, this is not that they must be, this is to say that they must be compared to each other. So for such properties as width and mass, in order to say that something is wider or more massive, we imply that those things have more width or more mass than some other things. Okay, for goodness, however, we cannot simply state that those things are better and best, respectively, which have greater and the greatest tendential necessity. Why is this? Yet again, this is because of the feature of tendential necessity inherent in goodness, and therefore betterness as well. If we're going to state that something has tendential necessity, we need to pick out that for which it is tendentially necessary. Again, always teleological. If we were, for instance, to look around and things in the universe which have tendential necessity and state, look there, that rock has more tendential necessity than this sulfuric acid. This mercuric oxide has more tendential necessity than this book. We'd be rightly very confused. So this, I'm arguing, is not how we speak about something's being better. It's not how we use the term. So tendential necessity, we must emphasize once again, always makes reference to a telos through the addition of the word for. This teleological way, indeed, is the only way it can be meaningfully used. So, again, this then in order to truly understand what we're talking about when we say that something is better than something else, we must go to the very heart of what it means for something to be better. So something's being better, and not simply something's being better for, is ultimately dependent on the degree to which various functions are tendentially necessary for this telos. Now, I know it's probably mind-boggling at this point, but because it's very, very in-depth and very dense, I have to admit. But there's no other way of going about it. It's a very complex analysis. So now, just to reveal a little bit more of what I mean, I think I've said it better, very well in this section as well, where there's an objection. So one might object that comparativeness, and I swear I'll stop after this, because it's very dense. I understand, it's very dense. So one might object that comparativeness, or something's being comparative, is that which also makes something's being wider possible, but this is irrelevant. As we've previously stated, x's being wider than y depends on the quantity of x's width in comparison to y. Width here is obviously not comparativeness, or something's being comparative. By contrast, x's being better than y depends on the teleology of x and y, and then the quantity of x's goodness in comparison to y relative to some telos. Again, telos meaning end. So, it is this teleology that distinguishes these two types of properties. Here, one might state goodness is obviously not comparativeness or something's being comparative, and one would be right. However, one would be ignoring the teleological component. What we must ask is the teleology. Whatever the teleology is, it could be survival or stealing successfully or anything else. It is the standard of x's being better than y for z. If the teleology, however, is not something so particular, but is, say, something's being better, and not simply better for, which is what we're looking for, then we must ask what the essence of betterness itself is. Betterness, in fact, is actually a type of comparativeness, namely the comparative tendential necessity of functions. But how is this, strictly speaking, a type of comparativeness? I did not, for instance, give the expression the comparing of tendential necessities. Instead, I gave the expression, I gave the comparative tendential necessity of functions. I hate keeping on saying it. It's a very long expression. Are they the same thing? First, the answer is no. They're not the same thing. The first is an action which entails the possession of the property of comparativeness, while the second is a property that does not necessarily entail the action of comparing. Consider that everything has a tendential necessity for some function. Keep in mind also that the greater or lesser tendential necessity for these different functions is independent of observers. So, anyway, since all things have teloi, however, these teloi must have comparatively tendentially necessary relationships to each other relative to some other teloi, and so on. In other words, there is some necessary condition of comparativeness that makes such teleological comparativeness possible and intelligible in the first place, and that is commensurability of teloi, or if you like, the fact that some teloi must be better than others, and ultimately that some telos must be the best. So essentially what I'm saying is there's some phenomenon of teleological comparativeness that we observe. We make value judgments, right? And betterness, I've said, is teleologically comparative tendential necessity of functions. In other words, the comparison of two different ends, the comparison of two different functions for some particular end. So that's betterness and also bestness. But I've claimed that there are some transcendental conditions for this to be the case. We have to ask, what makes this possible? What makes this meaningful? And I've said specifically, teleological, again, it's reflexive. But what actually further makes it, necessary? It's actually the act of teleological comparison. What makes the concept of the teleologically comparative tendential necessity of functions, or betterness, possible in the first place, again, is the phenomenon itself of teleological comparativeness. And this is the exciting part and interesting part, because we then have to ask, if we're going to narrow our search, is there anything in the universe, are there multiple things in the universe that exhibit teleological comparativeness? And what brings about teleological comparativeness? And that's teleological comparison. So what I mean by that is the act, our explicit or implicit act of comparing values. That itself is what makes the concept of betterness intelligible and meaningful. Underneath all of this analysis, that's what I'm saying. But you need the analysis to get to that point. Otherwise, people don't believe you, and rightly so. So really, what we're getting to is, what is teleological comparison? Teleological comparison is a feature of rationality. It's a feature, I said, remember, that rationality was important in the beginning. But it's a feature of rationality. And it only comes about in the world because of rationality. And this is actually how I defined rationality in the beginning. And remember, rationality, I'm defining it in using the same method, this transcendental reductionist approach, where I'm trying to get the broadest use of the word, finding the essential elements of the concept. And again, you might say, okay, so there's some sort of elitist implication of this. Just quite the opposite. Just quite the opposite. We can go through, if you'd really like, we can go through and try to understand. But you can read this if you want. If logical rationality and experiential rationality are necessary and sufficient for each other, as we've discovered in Chapter 2, then whatever is true of logical rationality is also true of experiential rationality. Furthermore, if logical rationality and experiential rationality are both necessary for the function of teleological comparison of tendential necessity, or even if, for the sake of argument, only one of them is necessary for the function of teleological comparison of tendential necessity, then it follows from our analysis that it is the case that at least one of the functions of rationality, logical or experiential, is not merely good for, but best for teleological comparison of tendential necessity. If it is the case that at least one of these two functions of rationality is best for teleological comparison of tendential necessity, then from biconditionality, which is a logical rule, it follows that it is the case that both functions of rationality, that is, both the logical and experiential functions, are the best for teleological comparison of tendential necessity. We must recognize, then, that we are not speaking of teleological comparison of tendential necessity in a conceptual vacuum. Teleological comparison of tendential necessity is inextricably logically tied to rationality. What follows from this is equally momentous. If it is the case that teleological comparison of tendential necessity is the best function that exists, then it is an analytic consequence that rationality is the best function that exists. So rationality, it is what would be considered the greatest good. But it's actually not rationality itself, it's what I call best rationality. Now, I want to leave us enough time to actually talk about some more substantive issues. I mean, I think you could have a whole lecture on this just by itself. I have the implications of this I think, specifically with the particular concept of rationality as I've presented it, is a particular kind of value system oriented toward personal liberation. And personal liberation, not meaning that we're going to have everybody homogenous. The opposite, have everybody accepting of heterogeneity in society. And for the purpose of personal liberation. And what I will say is, I'm not going to go into great detail here. It might come up in our discussion, and I might be able to read a passage, but what comes up here is 4 essential values, 4 principal values that emerge from this system, supreme values. So the first is best logical judgment. Best conceptual synthesis is the second. Best conceptual abstraction, and best freedom. Now again, conceptual synthesis does not mean like what we think of as intelligence. It's a culturally constructed concept. If you guys are interested, we can talk about that, but I want you to speak soon. And my question to you is that if this is what this system results in, I want to ask you, what do you value? And how will you achieve liberation if this is the implication of it? What are you going to do? My answer to this is massive, decisive, but self-critical action every day. And striving. This concept of striving. And I can go into this more, but I particularly think that this values theory, this value system, is coming hopefully at a very pivotal time in human history, because there's a lot that's been forgotten in, or a lot that's not been talked about in contemporary discourse that needs to be talked about more, and less talked about and more acted upon, because there's a global financial crisis, ecological crisis, social crisis, multiple, and we have to part of liberation, I think, and why Bandura's theory is specifically relevant, is that part of liberation is self-criticism, self-analysis, and constantly questioning the reality of the situation. Is this, for instance, is our education system, like asking things like this, is our education system really the education system we want? Is the economic system really the economic system we should have? And why are we doing the things that we're doing every day? Is it because we're just sort of subconsciously following it, we're automatically living? Or is it because we have ourselves determined and directed our own lives? And we've said, I'm going to get up and I'm going to do this today. Maybe what everybody is telling me is not correct. And that's a sort of a brave decision to make, to wake up maybe and realize what everybody is telling me is not correct. I have to change my value orientation. I have to change the way I go about living in light of making this realization that there are some false assumptions here. There are tons of false assumptions and mythologies that I'm following. So that's a very loaded conversation in itself. But what I would like to do is just open it up to all of you, and sort of, maybe Dr. Lee, you can sort of stimulate a little bit of discussion for me. I don't know. Well,
those are very broad.
Yeah. They are very broad. Well, I get more specific, but I don't want to. That's a whole lecture in itself, as I said.
Well, let me ask you about your work. What do you think you're contributing to the value field in general, and what's discussed out there right now?
Yeah. Well, definitely the idea of a grammar of value, which has not been brought together and sort of comprehensively analyzed. There's no specific system that has been brought together in a comprehensive manner to demonstrate in what exactly the grammar, a grammar of value or an innate value system.
What a grammar of value means.
Yeah, so when I talked about Carnap before, and I talked about the analytic philosophers, and I talked about Philippa Foot, so all of them, you know, in the analytic tradition, as I said before, is that their goal was to, and still is to a large extent, to find out what reality is like and what, you know, how to solve some of these philosophical problems using a more precise understanding of our language and how we use language and how we use concepts. And so, for instance, before I said, you know, this is actually one of Chomsky's main examples, and I love this example to demonstrate what a logical, linguistic conceptual framework is. I don't know what somebody was studying here. So, I forget the precise example, but Chomsky uses, is there any chalk? I should have checked that before I tried to write on the board. But, okay, so, oh yeah, there is chalk over here. Oh, the chalk that they give you is so small here. What are they doing to you guys? Anyway, so I forget if this is the complete expression, but green dreams sleep furiously. Is that the full? I think that's the full expression that he gives. Am I right? I think that's correct. And then, so, in order to demonstrate this idea of a grammar or a framework, so green belongs to some sort of conceptual framework. You might call it the color framework. So you can only call things colors or assign colors to things that have color or are able to have color. A dream can't have color. Or like, you could even take it further and say a colorless thing cannot have color. It's sort of straightforward, and if you put it in those terms. So there's no such thing as a green dream, at least literally. That's important. You could say it poetically. You could talk about it in some other terms, but you can't talk about literally a green dream. And then a dream is not something that sleeps. A dream belongs to a framework of something that one has while one sleeps. And it does not belong to the framework of something that itself sleeps. Certain things belong to a framework in which things sleep. So animals sleep, humans sleep. You know, those are all things, those are all concepts which fit within that framework of sleeping. And then you could call it, you know, something like the sleeping framework. So, and then nothing can sleep furiously. I mean, I guess maybe it's conceivable, but the idea is that, does everybody sort of understand what this kind of a framework means now? Or is somebody still, do you have a...
I think it kind of like means like each of like the terms means kind of like the opposite in a way, like, but they're kind of like interrelated to each other.
Well, so if you can think about here. Let's actually do a little bit of an exercise. So like, so what would belong in a color framework? Okay. So like, let's just strawberries or something. Yeah, like, and you know, chairs, right, or something like that. That could have color. What about the number 6? Okay, so the number 6 can't have color. Like, so the number 6 is outside the framework. So if you wanted to say a blue 6, that's not literally meaningful. So in the same way that we've talked about grammars in ordinary speech, we can apply this to value as well. So Philippa Foot was somebody who said, okay, well, this framework is life. That's we're going to set up, you know, value belongs in a life framework, and the only thing that the concept of value can be meaningful in is in the context of something referring to life. Yeah?
I don't want to interrupt, but do you know when she said that?
In actually 2001.
Okay, because there are other philosophers. There's another philosopher that I can think of before her.
Yeah, Anscombe, or I mean, even Aristotle to some extent.
Okay.
Yeah. Was it a female philosopher? Do you remember? Because it might have been Anscombe.
Ayn Rand. So.
Oh, in Rand. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Rand made a slightly different point, actually. Not specifically that it was that it was life, but it's actually a slightly different concept. But yeah, it's along the same lines. But in terms of a framework.
No, I just know that she said that it's only the concept of life that makes the concept of value possible. But I don't want to really.
Oh no, yeah, you're right. But it's life, and there's a certain conception that she's giving to. Yeah, you're right. So 6 falls outside that, and anything that falls outside this life framework cannot be valuable or cannot be considered valuable. I give an even more exhaustive framework, and you could think of it as encompassing these 2 frameworks. And this is an existence framework. So anything in existence, existence itself gives meaning to the concept of value. So it's inside the framework, whereas it was outside this before. If that gives it a little more illustration, literally, I hope that makes it clearer. Bill, you look very confused. Do you have critiques or comments or questions or?
I'm trying to think of what I phrase the question.
Sure. Well, I know you guys have been studying or talking about the trolley dilemma, right? And you might want to, I don't know if you are interested in exploring this or in the context of this theory, how this theory would apply to that situation. I don't know.
Go for it.
Yeah.
Well, they want you to go ahead and do that, but I have another question.
Yeah, sure. No. Questions before we do other stuff.
I'm a little confused about, I mean, you established that there needs to be this end or purpose in order to sort of look at any action. It's always for some purpose, even if it's just implicit. But then, how does one distinguish between the different ends? And okay, you can look at an action, right, and say that this is more suitable to the achievement of end X. But when you compare the different ends of, say, 2 actions, and you try to make an assessment of the quality and the comparative quality of those ends, I'm trying to fit that question into the context of what you're saying here.
What I'm saying here?
Well, it's in general your thesis.
The thesis. Okay.
Yeah.
So that there must be some objective way of measuring what particular end is better. Or?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
So so everybody by now understands that telos means end, I guess. Yeah. So let's say we have. I find that pictures are really helpful. Do you guys find that too? I just find the pictures are helpful. So so you can have telos A, okay, and you can have telos B, and let's say telos C. So and let's say you have X, you have Y, and you have Z. So X and Y and Z are, let's say, this is friendship, this is, I don't know, this is, or no, the meeting for lunch with a friend or something. This is going to a cafe, and this is, I don't know, or that's the same thing. Going to a concert or something, and this is, I don't know, something else. It's something else. So this is X, Y, and Z. They're possible decisions you can make, possible actions, courses of action you could take. And they all are sort of they have, again, some tendential necessity toward each of these teloi. So, for instance, x, is that term making sense to you by now, or should I try to elucidate that further?
It makes sense.
Makes sense, okay. So, some necessary tendency. So, it has some tendential necessity, so let's say x has some tendency to fulfill, we can actually assign probability values to it. I don't know if you're familiar with probability theory, but it's 0 to 1. 0 meaning the event is completely improbable, and 1 meaning it's completely probable. It will happen. It necessarily will happen. Anything in between is just a probability in between. So x has some probability of yielding A. And it also has some probability of yielding B, some probability of yielding telos C. But in the end, we have to ask, okay, which of these, actually, let me make this slightly more slightly less confusing. Not slightly more confusing. So I'm just gonna say telos. I'm just gonna say telos. So let's say x has 0.5 tendency, probability of reaching it. This has 0.6, and then this has 0.2. So if this telos is intrinsically good, if this n is intrinsically good, then which action should you take? Yeah, so you should take y. But you have to ask, oh, well, why, how is this telos intrinsically good, right? Because you could go on forever and ever and ever. You could say, oh, well, why is that telos good? Oh, well, it's good for another telos. Well, why is that telos good? Well, it's good for another telos. Okay, and that's the perennial problem we face. That's actually one of the issues that I'm tackling, is that it ends at some point. And why does it end at some point? Because I want to phrase this correctly. So what the final telos is, what it should be satisfying, what your action should be satisfying, is that thing which is ultimately intrinsically valuable. And how do you determine whether it's intrinsically valuable? Well, now we can introduce telos A and telos B. Now, how do we determine the intrinsic value of it? Whether we should go toward telos A or telos B? Well, the idea is that we found something, and I'm just gonna, it helps writing it again. So actually, it's, well actually I should just say, or actually, so best rationality. That is the summum bonum, that is the greatest good. So if you have two teloi to choose from, you are going to, and that's kind of nebulous for now, but again, that would take a whole lecture in itself to explain what is best rationality. But the way you choose between different teloi is you ask, oh, well, which teloi leads to best rationality? It has a greater tendency to yield that. And you'd say, okay, well, this one has 0.2, and this one has 0.5. So it looks like maybe we've made the wrong decision. If we picked y, then we probably made the wrong decision, because this has a 0.2 probability of yielding best rationality. This has a 0.5 probability. We should have chosen some activity associated with telos B. That's essentially the idea behind it. And your issue was, well, how do we find that ultimate telos? Well, the issue is, the whole idea is that we went through the whole proof of it. We essentially went through the whole proof of it. But I mean, I'm happy to discuss it with you further if you want. Yeah.
So even granting you know the value hierarchies, and eventually you have
yeah.
the best rationality, I don't understand how you get some objective measurement of x, y, and z, or telos A and B. How do you give a numerical value to any of that? Isn't that the same problem with utilitarianism?
No, actually, because in utilitarianism, they're using pretend measures. They're saying that there's something called a util and a dolor, which you can measure that doesn't exist. Probability exists. I mean, there's a long-run relative frequency interpretation of probability that's fairly accurate. And even if that changed, you would actually be able to, if in the future we found out, oh, probability is actually different. Well, using a different system to describe this in the future. But
so one of the examples you gave before was what job or what career should I take for an economic advantage?
Yeah.
So that's a rather vague question. Using your theory, how could you possibly evaluate all the outcomes and assign probabilities to those and be able to use that?
Okay, so essentially, I mean, I'm tempted to read, but I'm tempted to read the specific part. But essentially what you're asking, and why I'm saying, okay, my theory can answer that question, is you're pointing toward a question which is really what sort of thing, what is my telos? What is my individual telos? Because we face the issue of saying, okay, yes, there's this ultimate telos best rationality, but like, okay, so different people have different teloi, right? Everybody's different. Everybody has a different essence, a different identity. And so, but the claim here is that there's a different manifestation of best rationality for every particular person. So every particular person has this telos of best rationality, but there are subsets of this telos, subsets in terms of manifestation of this telos with respect to each individual. Now, how do you figure out that telos? Right.
But I think even granting, say everybody knew what that was, I still don't think you're able to effectively assign values to get to that. I don't think you can find the X, Y, and Z, or the values of X, Y, and Z.
Well, it's not that it's impossible, it's very difficult. I would say it's very difficult. It's empirically very difficult. It's less of a theoretical problem than an empirical problem. Because like, okay, so I'm figuring out what to do, right, in a particular situation. How do I know what the outcomes are going to be? This is a difficult question. How do I know which action is going to lead to what outcome, or you know, which action is more probable, more likely to yield this end that I'm looking for? And that's more of an empirical problem than anything. What do you see? Do you see something else? Or
the application of it, wouldn't that be the most important part?
Yeah, the application is important. So this is what you're pointing to is my favorite part, because what it points to is the importance of logical rationality and the actual different ultimate values. So what I'm going to do is just really, this might partially answer your question. So I'll just read this part. So okay, the function of logical judgment is to judge using logic. Agents all use at least a minimal amount of logical judgment. But it is not the case that all agents use their logical judgment well. Some agents, for instance, make invalid inferences or inaccurate inductive judgments. But what makes this bad logical judgment? Let us see. If the function of logical judgment is to judge using logic, then the function of good logical judgment is to judge well using logic. But we must get more specific than this. I'm actually going to... okay. So if judging correctly is necessary for choosing well, then we are also wholly justified in stating that in order to choose well, we must judge well, and that judging correctly constitutes judging well. Since one's choices derive from one's judgment, and since good judgment concerning one's choices consists in picking out the justifiable claim concerning one's choices in accordance with the laws of logic, then the better choice is that choice which derives from the better judgment. So I mean, essentially, I'm not going to. Oh, actually, no. This is actually a good next part. Thus, we have explained how logical judgment can be good or bad, better or best. The virtues, and this is why it's a virtue theory. The virtues which one must exercise then for the best possible logical judgment one can attain are those things which are the most tendentially necessary for the development of the best judgment one can attain. These virtues will be discussed after we have discerned the best functioning of the other rational faculties. Okay, so essentially it's through the cultivation of virtue. The idea is that, yeah, I can't, I mean, and there's so much more, There are two essential parts of this, and if you read the book, I think this will answer a lot of your questions. So part of determining this is a virtue in itself. Part of determining what the outcome is what is called phronesis. in virtue theory, or good judgment. So you have to develop this virtue in order to be able to discern. And it's very difficult. And who said life isn't difficult? Right? But this is an imperative that we develop these kinds of virtues, good judgment. And we also, and also another essential part of this, to understanding the outcome of the situation and its impact for you and your telos, is self-knowledge. And that's why self-knowledge is so important, because if you do not have self-knowledge, and the most intricate self-knowledge, then you will not be able to know what telos you should be following in the first place, let alone the judgment of these probabilities. You will not be as clear as you possibly can be about what this is in the end, what this telos is for you. Yeah?
So, when you're talking about like the probabilities, and like if the telos B has 0.5 like success rate of getting to the best rationality, I mean, would you take as a whole, like say X, Y, and Z all had like 0.2 or 0.1 to get to telos B, then would Y going towards telos A then be the more the better judgment, because like if you're not likely to get to telos B, even if you're likely to get to the best rationality through telos B, it doesn't help if you don't get there to begin with.
Yeah. Okay, so you're talking about as different possible pathways. And yeah, certainly, it certainly could be the case that if I understand you correctly, you could have something like, let me see, what probability could I assign to this? So this is 0.2, this is 0.6 to 0.2, and this is, I guess you might want to say 0.2. Okay, so if Y here is going to lead to telos A, but telos A only has 0.2 probability of yielding best rationality, then you don't want to follow that, probably. What you'll want to follow, I mean, it depends on, we have to give context to this situation. In reality, it's not really disconnected like this. It's really more linear. It's sort of a series of events that transpire that make it in aggregate more probable that you'll reach this end goal. So yeah, I mean, this, in the end, this particular kind of mediation might not be a totally representative model, but that's not a model, that's a model that just came up with just now.
So you're saying, regardless of
maybe I didn't understand your question. Yeah.
So like, regardless that you have less probability of reaching telos B in the second case, it is still the better choice because it yields a 0.5 like probability of reaching best rationality. That just doesn't make sense to me because
so that this, you're saying that it doesn't make sense to you that this leading to this would be the better choice?
No, I was understanding that you were saying the other one would be the better choice because it has a higher probability of reaching best rationality. Did I understand you incorrectly?
Well, okay, so what we'd have to do, and this is actually like a more complex probability calculation.
It's just an and probability.
Yeah, It's
just an and function.
Yeah. What you'd have to do is you'd have to do a probability calculation of a union. No, not a union. There's a particular, I forget actually.
You just multiply them together. It's the chance of the first times the chance of the second.
I think actually it would be a conjunction probability, like you said. Conjunction.
Well, since they both have to happen, it's multiplicative.
I think actually no. You might be right. I mean, I'd have to actually look at this a little more closely, but yeah, there is some probabilistic operation that you employ here. I think you're right, the multiplicative, and you'd essentially go 0.6 times 0.2, 0.2 times 0.5, it really depends on the sequence of events, really, and it depends on it really depends on what, I think, yeah, I mean, it might be multiplicative. I think you might be right. I don't want to commit to that yet. But there is some calculation that you would do, in theory, I'd have to go into a probability theory book and look it up again to figure it out. But
just 12% to 10%.
Yeah, I mean, one of them's smaller. So this is going to be a smaller probability overall. This is going to be larger probability. So yeah, the best pathway would be telos A, something like that. So, I mean, it's really, you know why I don't like doing this? Because what it makes it look like is it's reductionistic to just, probability values. This is what this theory is all about. It's like, probability theory, but that's really not. It's just a tool. Probability theory is just a tool to say, well, it's just to tell you when you're making action, when you're deciding on what action to take, which one is more likely, which outcome is more likely. If the other one is more likely, then that gives me some information that would lead me to either reject it if it's bad, or if it's worse, or accept it if it's better. And so, yeah, in this case, there's you're going to do some sort of operation from between this probability and this probability. Whatever value is smaller is the one you'd get rid of.
I understand what you're saying, and if we're applying this to realistically to life, and I have three choices that I have to examine, right, and choose which of the three is going to lead me towards a better end.
Yeah.
And looking at this example has made me think that you have to really have a good concept of how your choices would affect you in the future, because you could have a value, like a choice that's like, okay, this is really looking good, and then it's going to lead you to like a telos B situation where you're not gonna. Yes. So how is that realistically possible?
It's a huge demand. What I'm saying is, I'm not saying it's easy, and life isn't easy. It's a huge demand. But what I'm hoping is that it is illuminating, because we realize then the magnitude of the importance of every single decision we make. Because with every decision we make is an associated probability towards some end, and one little thing could change everything, right? So that's why in my theory there's an overarching importance placed upon really knowing reality very well, studying your environment very well, studying yourself very well, self-knowledge and really general knowledge. And then there's the question of what sort of knowledge should I know? That speaks to one's telos, and that's a different question I can answer too. But
it's just there's this kind of like funny problem about humanity. I wonder if you could just comment on it. Like you're saying that sort of this aim for best rationality, a concept which I would love if you could elucidate. I don't know that we have the time though. Yeah. But leaving that aside for now, if that's sort of the aim of human activity, doesn't one need to have a degree of rationality and self-knowledge in order to be even able to assess the playing field and that even attain that rationality? So you're kind of, the end is sort of necessary in order to attain it. You know, like having some, you need to be rational.
Having some prior faculties, something like that, or capacities. So so that's not so much a. So here's where I think it's essentially there are potential issues. The concept of rationality, again, and I'm just very, very careful about this because it's so misused. It's just so misused and very bad. Well, let's actually go back to, so this statement, I don't know who can read logic here, but this essentially means, so this is essentially the definition that I've given for rationality. And it's based on social cognitive theory, it's based on cognitive neuroscience, it's based on phenomenology as well. So rationality in the most general sense, meaning the phenomenon that makes a person a person. So the phenomenon that it's not based on intelligence, it's not particularistic in the sense that, if you're smarter, you're more rational. That's not the sense that I'm using it. It's you're either rational or you're not. You're either A or you're B. And what I'm saying is here, essentially, this is a biconditional statement. So if A has logical judgment, and these are described as well. I mean, again, we don't have time to go into all of the definitions. But A has logical judgment, and A has conceptual synthesis, and A has conceptual abstraction if and only if A has freedom. And it's based on social cognitive definitions, essentially, and cognitive neuroscience definitions. But so that is the definition. Now, if you are not a voluntary entity, if you're not a voluntary agent, then you don't have these. If you're not something that makes choices, you don't have these. So we're not talking about somebody who's like some entity or somebody who is sort of less intelligent or less capable. But so I'm not using the word rationality in that way. But what you point to is there's some sort of necessary capacity to go out and cultivate best rationality in the first place. And I would say, yes, you are absolutely right. And that's actually, that speaks to a social need. And that speaks more to a social need, and it speaks to a cultural need, and it speaks to a personal need, and maybe an economic need. There are certain preconditions that people need to have met in order to reach the telos, to reach the summum bonum. And so it's imperative that we create these kinds of societies, the kinds of societies where people can achieve these, this telos. And you notice here freedom is here quite prominently. It's an essential aspect of agency, voluntariness, choice, purposiveness. And best freedom is what I call liberation. We need, that's the telos of freedom, liberation. So and again, nebulous and not defined, because I'm not defining it here, but defined in the book. Very difficult to go through again and without maybe some background in social cognitive theory and some other disciplines. But yeah, does that give a clearer answer? Yes, I would say there are preconditions. There are definitely, but that's more of an imperative to help people achieve those preconditions. Did I answer your question or no? Am I beating around the bush?
No, you pointed to the aspect of your theory that I think I would need to be more familiar with, your book, as you say.
Yeah. You're saying because these concepts are still, they're vague.
Yeah.
Because you don't know what they mean.
Yeah. Completely wrap my head around it.
Yeah. And yeah.
But I'm seeing your point that
the separate discussion.
The rationality is intelligence. You sort of have this logical and experiential rationality.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, one side of this is logical rationality. Actually, one side of the biconditional is logical rationality. The other side of the biconditional is experiential rationality. And actually, this is, I actually wrote this wrong. Because I actually wrote this wrong. It should be freedom, conceptual synthesis, and conceptual abstraction, and then logical judgment on the other side.
That's what I understand.
Yeah. So logical judgment is on one side. And glad I caught this now, because that's actually part of my proof, and I should send them back this edit before it goes to print. So I actually can, yes, good. I'm glad I did this now.
I'll be taking a photo picture of you.
So yeah, I mean, and that's why experiential rationality is so important as well. So, any other questions or comments or critiques?
How heavily would you say that you drew upon Aristotle's normative?
Well, the whole tradition is following in the footsteps of Aristotle in some sense. Except, I mean, I obviously I don't follow in the footsteps of his misogyny or slavery, pro-slavery views. But the whole virtue theoretical tradition follows in his footsteps ultimately, and other theorists' footsteps. But yeah, I think in some sense the theory is mirroring his own theory, what he would, but not quite in the same way, because when he said the summum bonum is rationality, it was theoria. That is the summum bonum, and theoria is a very specific kind or what conception of rationality. And I'm not looking for conceptions of rationality, I'm looking for the concept of rationality. And again, transcendental reductionism, I'm trying to find the most general concepts, the most essential concepts for rationality. Theoria means that you study philosophy and science, and roughly like that, something along those lines. And so, I mean, the summum bonum is essentially intelligence in some sense for Aristotle. I wouldn't say the summum bonum is intelligence, although I'm wrongly translating these things. These things can't be totally translated, but so yeah, that's really the answer to it. But there's been a resurgence of virtue theory, really, in the 20th century. There's, along with the linguistic turn, there's also been the turn to virtue, it's called, in ethics. So I guess I'm part of the tide that's coming in that sense. So, anything else, or are we adjourned? I think we're adjourned, right?
I just want to commend you for having accomplished so much. I think it shows a lot of diligence, on your part.
Maybe obsession is the better word. Maybe obsession is the better word, I think.
But I think it's very admirable.
Yeah. Thanks. And shameless plug. So if any of you want to buy the book, the best place to buy it is shop.com/Petro. And you can, the cheapest prices right now are Barnes & Noble and what else is there? Barnes & Noble and Walmart have the cheapest prices right now. So you can actually access it through that site, and you can get cash back from them too. So you get even cheaper price. So I'll leave that there.
Thank you.
Yeah.